Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon or connected through the internet. Today, today's a double Torah portion. It's Hukat, which is found in Numbers 19, verse 1 through Numbers 22, verse 1. And then Balak or Balak, chapters 22, verse 2 and 25, verse 9. Now, remember, I think we've said before that the term hukat can be translated as ordinance or statute. And it's something that, it's a commandment that for us does not have any logical understanding. We try to understand it and we just can't find any logic to it. So that's what a hukat is. It's a commandment that to us it doesn't make any sense or any logic, but to God, He mandated it, so whether we understand it or not is something that has to be done. And so what is going to be speaking about here is the ritual of the red heifer, or in Hebrew is the word para aduma. Para means cow, and aduma means red, or kind of like a reddish color. Okay, so I'll be showing you a PowerPoint so you can see. You want the para? Okay. Yeah, Balak is Numbers 22:1 and 25 up to 25:9. So para aduma is the red cow. Okay, the ritual of the red heifer or the red cow. That's what we're going to be looking into a little bit deeper today. Why? Because it's one of those commandments that God says is a perpetual commandment, something that we have to know and understand, because eventually in the future, this is something that has to be done because it has to do with purification, the laws of purification. And if the third temple, once the third temple is built or right before, it can be used, the priests, the Levites, all the instrumentation, everything, utensils and everything, has to be purified. And one of the ways they're going to do that is through the ashes of the red heifer. Okay, so we're going to, let me put the PowerPoint for you. So Hukat, para aduma, found in Numbers chapter 19, verse 1 through chapter 22, verse 1. And starting verse 1, it says, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, this is the statute or hukat of the Torah, which Adonai commanded, saying, speak to the children of Israel that they bring to you a flawless red heifer, which is the same thing as a cow, on which there is no blemish and on which has never been a yoke. In other words, it has never done any labor. Has never been used for secular labor. And usually when they start putting a yoke on a young cows at the age of 2 or 3 years old, therefore it's understood that this red heifer has to be less than 3 years old. Okay. And it says in verse 3, give her to Eleazar the Cohen, the priest. He will take her outside the camp and slaughter her in his presence. Then Eleazar the Cohen is to take some of the blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. So again, this red cow, in case in Israel right now, they have a place where they're raising red cows. And even though it's red, it's not like really, really red. It's a brownish kind of brick color. It's a combination of red and brown, okay? Kind of like a burnt orange or kind of, they call it red, but we know it's more like a brownish with a little tinge of red. So what they have here is they have a farm and they're raising all these cows. So both the male and the females are red, and they're trying to get a perfect, unblemished red heifer. And the thing is, in this other picture, what we have is one of the rabbis that work at the Institute. And if you notice, he has here a magnifying glass, because they have to go through every single hair of these animals, because according to the laws related to the red heifer, it cannot have more than 3 hairs that are of a different color. If they're white, if they're black, or any other color that's different from the rest of the reddish brown color, that disqualifies the red cow. So the thing is that for over 2,000 years, they have not had a red heifer. Okay, the last one that that the ritual was done with, the last one was over 2,000 years ago. And according to the Mishnah, that has a book, a Mishnah, just what they call a tractate, just dedicated to the red heifer, says that so far there have been 9 of them, of which the first one was offered up by, well, it's not really an offering, but that was slaughtered by Moses. Then the second one was slaughtered by Ezra when they came back from Babylon, because they had to purify the people and the priests and the Levites and everything in the temple. One was burned during the time of Ezra. Then some other priests, because even though here it says that Eliezer, it's really a duty of the high priest to do the ritual of the red heifer. So there's been 9 so far, and the tradition says, according to their understanding, that when the 10th one shows up, that means we're ready for the Messianic age. The Messiah is ready to come or to be present. Okay. So here we have the priest coming out of the temple, because the red heifer has to be slaughtered on the Mount of Olives outside. Once the temple was in Jerusalem, the red heifer had to be slaughtered outside the camp or outside the temple area. And in Jerusalem, that would be the Mount of Olives. Verse 5. It says, and then it says in verse 4 that Eliezer the Cohen is to take some of the blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. Remember, they're in the desert, so the Mishkan, which is a tabernacle, the Cohen has to take some of that blood and sprinkle it towards the what would be the veil of the entrance to the holy place, sprinkled from where he's at, because remember that the cow has to be slaughtered outside the tent of meeting, in a place that they had during that time in the wilderness. But once they're in Jerusalem, from where the priest is, because he's going to be at the Mount of Olives, which is completely opposite east of the temple, he has to sprinkle 7 times towards, and we're going to see that. Okay, just to give you some orientation. This is on top of the the Temple Mount. Here we have the temple, and what's around here are the outside walls. They're called retention walls. Like today, when you go to Israel and you go to the Western Wall or the Kotel, you're on this wall. Okay, you're not within the walls of the sanctuary per se. Okay, this is called the Mikdash. This is the temple. All this is the temple complex. So this is looking east. So if we walk from here all the way east, we would go to the Mount of Olives. So this is part of the retention wall. Today is the Western Wall. So this is when we go to Israel, this is what we're standing or looking towards. It's not really the original walls around the Mikdash, the temple itself. Okay, so this is the perspective. Here you have the south. Here's the north, and you know you're in the north because this would be what's called the Antonia Fortress. This is where they had all the Roman soldiers during the time of the Second Temple. And so we're looking east. And so here, coming out through this gate, you would go through a gate here in the east, which is called the Shushan Gate. The Shushan Gate, and from there, the priest with the cow and everybody would go out towards the Mount of Olives. So we left the temple and we're going through this bridge. There used to be a bridge that united the Temple Mount with the Mount of Olives. The people here on the Mount of Olives, where this altar is, where the red heifer would be slaughtered and burnt. The Golden Gate, Yeah, this would be here where today what's called the Golden Gate. That's from the outside walls of the temple. Okay.
That's where King, what is it? Salamim that he tied seal.
Yes. Now we're going to talk about that. Why did they seal this gate? Okay, so before the temple was destroyed, there was this bridge, and if you notice, there's a lot of arches because they had to build this first of all to level it at the same height with the Temple Mount, and number two, here this is the Kidron Valley, and now today there is here a cemetery, and a Muslim cemetery. But before, why? Even the Temple Mount, even the temple per se, before they built the temple, they had to build arches. They had to build arches to level out the land, and also arches because to make sure that the temple was not sitting on any graves or any bones of humans or anything that would defile them. Why? Because the red heifer has to do with purifying individuals that become ritually impure or ritually contaminated due to the death of a human or human bones. And so, yes.
So that up there, is that the Temple Mount?
This here is all this here is a Temple Mount. Part of this here, this is the temple.
Okay.
So this around here is a Temple Mount.
Okay.
And this is the city around the Temple Mount.
Okay.
From here, you can't see it, but there's an elevation. The Temple Mount is higher than the city. Okay, so people would go up to the mount, up to the temple. But the bridge would level the Mount of Olives with the temple, the entrance to the temple.
So what are they standing on now? What is this?
This is the Mount of Olives here.
Okay.
Okay, before there used to be an altar. And if you see, there's also arches here. To elevate the terrain, first of all, to be at the level was the Temple Mount, but also to make sure that this altar is not sitting on ground that there might be a grave or bones of humans or anything that could defile the ritual they're doing. Because you have to understand, when the priests come out here with the cow, they're all in a state of ritual purity. So they can't walk over anything that's a grave, or they can't walk over anything there might be some bones of people, okay? Because the death of an individual is the thing that causes, is death of a person is what causes the greatest contamination or impurity to an individual in terms of rituals. Okay, in terms of rituals. Rituals means that if you're, let's say you're somewhere and somebody you're in a house, somebody in the house dies, according to the laws of ritual purity, everybody within that roof, that household that was present when that individual died is contaminated by death. Ritual contamination. That means you had to go through the ritual of the ashes of the red heifer, be sprinkled with that, to go back to a state of purity. Because if you're not in a state of defilement, ritual defilement, and you go into the house of the Lord, you contaminate his house. You contaminate his sacred space. So the thing is to avoid that. Okay, you had a question, RC?
No, I had a question as a comment, because it shows on that picture that the arches were one on top of the other.
Uh-huh.
When we were at this last time in Israel, we did like behind the scenes,
Mm-hmm.
and they're staggered, and they said it's because they're trying to make stronger.
Right.
To make it stronger.
Right.
As well, and they also have it in the other side.
Right. It's all over. That's why under the Temple Mount, where the temple was, there's so many tunnels, because they had to make these tunnels to build these arches. And so it's kind of like a labyrinth. It's like a maze. So there's tunnels all over the place. As a matter of fact, okay, so we are here. This here is the Temple Mount, the Mount of Olives, and here's the Temple Mount. Okay, this is Jerusalem. Across from here is the Mount of Olives.
How long a distance?
It can't be less than 2,000 cubits. How much is 2,000 cubits? A cubit is 18 inches, so multiply 18 by 2,000, then divide it by whatever to give you the distance. Okay, a cubit. From the Temple Mount to the Mount of Olives.
Oh,
It can't be more than 2,000 cubits. Because all that is sacred space, sacred ground.
Didn't you, when you were in Israel the last time, didn't you go in those tunnels?
I went put in the other side, not in this
Yeah.
side.
Well, this is today in the Temple Mount. There's this area where the Muslims have made a mosque. But if you see these arches, these things are original. These things are original. Now they've made it into a mosque. And when you go in Temple Mount, there's some stairs that go down, like a basement. But it's not really a basement. It's all these arches that were there. They sustain the area where the temple used to be sitting on. Okay, because first of all, it's built up to level the land, and number two, to make sure that nothing down here, had there been any bones or anything, all that was taken out, because it cannot be defiled. The land, where the temple sits, cannot be defiled by bones or graves or anything like that. So today, this is there, but it's under Muslim occupancy. So therefore, you can't go there, but they go down there, and this is right under where the temple was sitting. So all these arches are still there. Okay, but even though looks nice and it's been built around, I think the Temple Mount is 35 acres, I think, something like that. So just imagine the amount of tunnels under those 35 acres. So that's why they say that in one of those tunnels, the ark is still there somewhere. Some of them say from the Temple Institute that they know where it is, but they can't say it. Why? Because you're going to have, people that don't want the temple to be built going to go in there and destroy it. Okay. So going back to where we were, it says, so then Eliezer has to take blood from the animal, from the cow, and looking towards the temple, looking towards here, he's going to sprinkle from where he's at. If he's standing here, he's going to take blood and sprinkle with his fingers 7 times towards the temple, okay, towards the entrance. Because the thing is that from where he's at, he's supposed to be able to see the veil. That's the veil that enters into the holy place. Okay, remember there's the veil that got torn? From the Temple Mount, you could have seen it from where you were. That's how tall the temple per se, the building was. And that veil was humongous. So therefore, from up here, when he's sprinkling towards the temple, he needs to be looking like right directly to the entrance of the holy place. Not only that, the cow's head has to be turned so it is also looking towards the temple. Okay. So that's why it says when he has blood on his finger, sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. While watching, he is to burn the heifer, her hide, flesh, blood, and refuse. This animal has to be completely burnt. Nothing can be saved. Everything, the whole thing. And so the ashes, you're going to have the mixture of blood, you're going to have the mixture of the flesh, you're going to have the mixture of everything. Okay? So the Cohen is to take some cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool, and cast them into the midst of the burning heifer. So while the heifer is burning, he's going to take cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet wool and throw it into the fire. Now, why all these things? You have to understand that this ritual is to purify from death. Purify from any contamination from death. So this ritual is purifying people from any contact with death. Because death contaminates ritually. It makes an individual ritually impure or unclean. And anyone that is in a state of contamination from death cannot go into the presence of God. Why? Because God is a God of life. The temple is a place of life, is a sphere of life. So therefore, you cannot mix death and life. Okay, so if you're going to come in, you have to be ritually clean. So remember, this is for contamination with death. Whether you were in the presence of someone that just died, or you stepped over a grave, or you encountered a bone, or of course during this time, you know, if you walk around, it's like you're going into the forest, you're going to go hunting or whatever, and you find someone dead, you don't know if the person was killed or they died naturally. If you come in the presence of anyone dead, you are ritually unclean for 7 days. Okay, and it says here. So he has to take the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet. Why the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet? If you remember that also the ritual of the leper that becomes clean has to go through a ritual of complete cleansing. And the things they're going to use is cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet. Why? Because the leper is considered like someone that is dead. Again, it's to purify against the contamination of death. Why cedar? The cedar is a tree that grows very, very tall. And number two, it is very strong. It's a strong wood. So it represents strength. It represents might. Okay. Hyssop. The hyssop is a plant that absorbs liquids. So they remember when in Passover they put blood on the lintels of the homes. What did they use? Hyssop. Why? Because they could absorb the blood of the lamb with the hyssop and use it kind of like a paintbrush. So they would paint the lintel. And scarlet. Why scarlet is also mentioned? Because scarlet, here what they're saying, the wool had to be stained with scarlet. Scarlet was a color that they were able to get from the ink of a snail, of an animal. I think in this case it's a worm, a special worm. And that process of getting that scarlet was very costly. So what can we deduce from this? The cedar wood, remember that this is a purification. Any person that goes away from the presence of God is like you were dead. Okay? So cedar being something that represents something lofty, something high, something strong, the cedar wood is like showing us also, remember that mankind is the symbol for mankind is also trees. So when you're separated from God, you're basically dead. So the cedar wood represents arrogance. Arrogance. But then God, with the hyssop, represents humility. So he takes you from a state of loftiness and arrogance. He humbles you. Once you come in repentance and you come for the cleansing, he humbles you. But then he dresses you with scarlet. Scarlet is it's like kind of like the tzitzit. It's a costly color which only people that were rich or nobles or kings use this color. So he takes you from an arrogant state, he humbles you, but then he lifts you up again in his presence. Okay. Verse 7. Afterward, the Cohen, the priest, is to wash his clothes and bathe his flesh with the water, and afterward he may come back into the camp. Still, the Cohen or priest will be unclean until evening. Also, the one burning it is to wash his clothes and bathe his flesh with the water, and he will be unclean until evening. So this is where the mystery comes. How is it possible? This is another view just to show you this is the temple, and here they're slaughtering the animal, and the animal has to be facing the temple. Okay, and then the priest with the blood sprinkles towards the entrance of the temple. And here they have the hyssop and the scarlet and the wood that they're going to use, because they have to mix the ashes with living waters to then sprinkle upon the people. Here what I'm showing is, this is the Temple Mount, this is the east, and this is the south. One of the things that they used that was living waters is like from water from the pool of Shiloah, or how you say in English? Siloam, anyway. Siloam pool is Shiloah, which means someone that has been sent. So from the south, on the south side of the temple, there was a gate called the water gate. And so they would go down through that water gate, down to the pool and get waters, and then come back up to the temple. But towards the east, they would go out towards the east to the Mount of Olives with the cow to burn her at the Mount of Olives. But the pools, like waters that they needed, living waters, because it has to be waters that are running, like in a spring, to use with the ashes of the red heifer. And here's the hyssop, which once the ashes were collected, and you have to remember, if you're burning this cow, this huge cow on the altar, which is wood, when everything is burnt and you pull out the ashes, you're going to be pulling out the wood, you're going to be pulling out everything that burnt there. So, but it has to be completely ashes. And you take those ashes, you mix it with living waters, and then you would use the hyssop, the cedar wood, and scarlet, and dip that in that water with the ashes, and you would sprinkle the individual. Now the thing is, the mystery is this is why it's a mystery. You have the priests that are in a ritual state of purity. They're clean, ritually clean. They haven't been contaminated with death. Okay? You have an individual that needs to be ritually cleansed because let's say this man here was his child. Someone in the tent died. And let's say he's the father, he has to take, take care of the body, the funeral arrangements, whatever, and his son helped him. So they became contaminated because of a death. Okay? If they want to go to the temple, they have to go through the waters and ashes of the red heifer. So they go to the priest who is in a state of ritual cleanliness. The priest hasn't been contaminated. So the priest takes the sprinkles the individuals with the waters and the ashes. So a priest is clean, the person's unclean. Once they receive the water, the sprinkling, the individuals become clean, but the priest becomes unclean. There's a transfer of contamination. So the question is, how does this happen? Nobody knows. Nobody understands. How is this possible? That's why it's considered an illogical thing, because no one can get the sense of how does this happen. But in a way, we can see that Messiah Yeshua, when he went to his death, he was a morally pure individual. And yet when we come to him, we give him our transgressions, our sin, and he takes them upon him. And so we go to him in an unclean state. He's clean. We give him our junk. He takes it, and then the uncleanliness is passed on to him. And so that's how he can make us pure again. So in a way, it's the same thing that's happening here. We don't understand the mystery behind it. We can't see it, but we know it happens. Okay, so in a way, the red cow represents what Yeshua did for us. Okay, we go to him in an uncleanly state. Of course, through Yeshua, there's two types of uncleanliness. There's ritual impurity, and then there's moral impurity. Okay. For ritual impurities were all these things in the temple. So if someone became ritually impure or unclean, there was a way of fixing it. Okay. But moral impurity, for moral impurity, there was no offering, there was nothing. That's why Yeshua had to die. Because it's only through the blood of Yeshua that this moral impurity, uncleanliness that's in our hearts and in our souls and in our minds is the only thing that can cleanse us from inside out. Okay? For ritual stuff, remember, ritual means that if you want to go into the temple or you want to go into the house of God, you cannot go in a state of uncleanliness. Okay? And even though people did things, you from the outside, you can't tell if someone is morally unclean or not. You don't know what's in the hearts of people, but God does. So the only way to fix that was through Yeshua. Because for stuff that we could see, I came in contact with a dead person. Well, let's do the ritual of the red heifer. You're cleansed, now you can go in. Okay. Verse 9 says, a clean man is to gather up the ashes of the heifer and put them in a clean place outside the camp. They are to be for the community of the children of Israel to use as water of purification from Sin. And the water purification is not so much from sin, but it's from contamination. Okay, it's not from sin, it's from contamination, with death. Verse 10, the one who gathers the heifer's ashes is also to wash his clothes as well as be unclean until evening. In other words, the individuals that did this ritual, including the priest that slaughtered the cow, and the individuals are going to take the ashes. When they do that, they become unclean, and so they have to wash their clothes and do a mikvah. Okay, they have to do a mikvah. This is also to show here another picture where we have a whole family, and the whole family is going to be sprinkled with the ashes and the water of the red heifer to be purified. Because you cannot come into a service, basically, if you're in a state of contamination through death. And again, the thing is, you cannot come into the presence of a holy, living God that gives life in a state that represents death. Okay? And this is the place when the second temple was standing. This is where they would put the ashes of the red heifer. Okay, so this is the second temple. This is the court of the women. There were buildings around. And this, if you can see this fence here, this is what's called the soreg, where anyone that was not a Jew or was not circumcised could go through here into the temple. So this is where what they call the lesser Sanhedrin would meet. And here they would put the ashes of the red heifer, because they would use them, like for example, for Passover. If you could not come and celebrate Passover if you were in a state of impurity, if you have been exposed to death. So everybody had to be sprinkled. Okay. So that's where it says here that they are to be for the community. Verse 9, a clean man is to gather up the ashes of the heifer and put them in a clean place outside the camp. They are to be for the community of children of Israel to use as water of purification, which when the temple was there, it was in this little small building here. The one who gathers the heifer's ashes is also to wash his clothes as well as be unclean until the evening. It will be a permanent statute for the children of Israel and for the outsider living among them. In other words, a convert. Someone that's a Gentile and converted and is part of Israel, they also have to do the same thing. It's a permanent statute, permanent law. Verse 11, whoever touches any dead body will be unclean for 7 days. He is to purify himself on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day, then he will be clean. In other words, you have to get sprinkled on the 3rd day and the 7th day of those 7 days of impurity. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd and 7th days, he will not be clean. Anyone touching the dead body of any man who does not purify himself defiles Adonai's tabernacle. So the issue here is not to defile or contaminate the house of God. And that person will be cut off from Israel. The word cut off there is karet, which means that this person will have a divine judgment, which means that God, one of two things can happen. They can die on the spot if they try to go in onto the Temple Mount or into the temple, or they can have a premature death. Because the cleansing water was not sprinkled on him, he is unclean, and his uncleanness will remain on him. This is the Torah for whenever a person dies in a tent. So the thing about contamination with death is that it can happen if you come in direct contact to it. It can happen if you're in the same area where there's a dead person, or it can happen if you touch any object that also has already been contaminated. The thing is that death is very contagious. In the spiritual sense, death is the most contaminating thing. So even though you don't see it, it contaminates anything close to it or anything that touches a dead body. If it's an animal, you're impure for 1 day. But if it's a person, you're impure for a whole 7 days. So then on the 3rd day, you have to be sprinkled, and on the 7th day, you have to be sprinkled to be completely ritually clean. Okay. Verse 17, for the unclean one, they are to take some of the ash of the burnt purification offering and pour some fresh water into a jar. Then a clean person will take some hyssop, dip it into the water, sprinkle it on the tent, all the furnishings, and the people who were there, as well as the one touching the bone, the one killed, the corpse of it, or the grave. So one can be contaminated by either touching a bone of a dead person, if someone was killed, a dead body, or a grave. That's why when the people were going, for example, to the festival, especially for Passover, what they would do is they would clean around the city of Jerusalem, and they would mark where there were any graves to let people know you cannot step on those in this area because there's a grave there. Okay, so they would mark. So when people are coming up to Jerusalem, they do not step on any graves or anything like that. Verse 20, however, that man who is unclean but does not purify himself will be cut off from the community. He has defiled the sanctuary of Adonai. Since the cleansing water was not sprinkled on him, he is unclean. This will be a permanent ordinance for them. In other words, if you know you've been contaminated by death and you don't do the purification with the ashes of the red heifer, in other words, you just decide, well, I'm not going to go through that. And then you decide to go to the temple, you know, you basically you're defying God. Because you're not supposed to go in a defiled state, in an uncleanly state. That's why it says, verse 21, this will be a permanent ordinance for them. The one sprinkling the cleansing water is also to wash his clothes, and anyone touching the cleansing water will be unclean until evening. Anything touched by an unclean person becomes unclean, and anyone touching it will be unclean until evening. In other words, this is very contagious. So today, this is the gate that today is called the Golden Gate or the Eastern Gate. For those of you that have been to Israel, you might have seen it, because this was one of the entrances. This is what would have been the Shushan Gate, where the priest would come out with the cow and go towards the Mount of Olives. So what have the Muslims done? Yeah, well, if this is the gate, I'm facing east toward the Mount of Olives. Okay, so this is the gate. The temple's back here, and you're looking towards the Mount of Olives. Okay, so if you're coming from the Mount of Olives, you would enter through here into the temple. Okay, so behind this gate is the temple. So you will walk from there to the Mount of Olives. So today, this is a grave site. This is a cemetery that belongs to the Muslims. Why? Because they understand the laws of purity and impurity. They understand the laws of being contaminated by death. So what's the idea? Because it's always been said the Messiah is going to come in through the east. So they have this cemetery here saying, well, because this all full of dead bones, Messiah cannot enter through the east gate. Okay, that's their deduction. But last week I found out that is not this gate. The Messiah is going to go through, and I'm going to show you. I didn't show this last night to the Spanish group because I didn't have the slides, because the topic came up and I wasn't planning on speaking about it. But this is the issue. The gate is not this one. There's another eastern gate of which the Bible is speaking about. So they've done this and they think Messiah, oh, he can't make it. Yeah, right. This is just a diagram to show you what we're talking about. This is the east side. Okay, this is the court of the women. This is the Nicanor gate. There's 12 steps that go up to, this is called the Azara. The Azara is where you have the temple building per se, the Mikdash. You have the altar. Okay, so this is east. This is west, this is north, and this is south. And so what they're talking about is the eastern gate that's all the way out there, one of the retention walls. Okay. This is what's called the Ulam. The Ulam is, okay, here's the altar, there's some stairs that go up when you're going to go into the temple building. Remember the veil? Okay, the veil is here. Okay, but once you cross the veil, you come into this, what's called the ulam, or like a foyer. Okay, because right before you go, this is the holy place. Right before you go into the holy place, there's another gate. Okay, there's a veil, there's a foyer, and then there's the gate. You just don't walk up the stairs and go directly into the holy place. No, not this one. This is completely straight. You go up the stairs. There's this passageway here. There's it's like a hallway. Okay, and then there's another gate, the real true gate. It's called the Great Gate, and that through that gate you go into the holy place. Okay, you just don't go up the stairs and go immediately into the presence of God. You just go up the stairs, you have a place, and then you go through these gates. Now, these gates in here were double. There were 2 sets of doors. But what I want you to see is this. This is the Olam. Here, these 2 little spaces here, you see a space here and a space here. Those are called wickets. Not wicked, wickets. And wickets in Hebrew means a small gate or small door. Okay, a wicket is a small door or small gate. And I'm going to see if, let me see if the other one shows better. Okay, this is a closer view. I need you to get this because this is very important. Yes, ma'am. I'm not changing it. Again, this is the east. This is the north. This is the west. This is the south. This is the altar. You go up the steps to the Olam. This is the Olam. Here where this looks a little bit white. This is where the veil was. Okay. So once you went through the veil, you went into this hallway. It has 2 wickets. You have one that's facing east towards the north side. I mean, these 2 are facing east, but you have one that's closer to the north and you have this one that's closer to the south, right? Go to Ezekiel. Go to the book of Ezekiel. Go to chapter 11, verse 23. Chapter 11, verse 23. Chapter 11 of Ezekiel is speaking when the glory of God left, when his presence left the temple. Remember that in the second temple, there was no ark. And in the first temple, because of all the idolatry and all the wrong things that the people of Israel did, God got fed up with them. And his visible presence, his Shekhinah, his glory left the temple. But it went out in a specific way. And it says here in verse 23, the glory of Adonai went up from within the city and stood still on the mountain that is to the east of the city. What is the mountain that is east to the city? Mount of Olives. Remember that the Temple Mount is in the city of Jerusalem. And the other mountain that's completely directly opposite, east, is the Mount of Olives. So it's telling you when God left, he made a stop at the Mount of Olives. Okay, he says, the glory of Adonai went up from within the city and then stood still on the mountain that is to the east of the city. The mountain that is east to the city is the Mount of Olives. Where does it say, where in the Bible says, where is the first place that Yeshua is going to step foot on? Mount of Olives, hello. Okay, go to chapter 43. Verse 1, Ezekiel 43, verse 1. It says, then he led me to the gate looking east, and behold, the glory of God was coming from the east. So there's 2 east. Because if he, the last thing he did was look from from the Mount of Olives, he's going to return from the same way. So he's coming from the east, but then this is the gate through which he enters, this one, the wicket. Why? Because this is facing east, but it's on the south side of the Ulam. And I'm going to show you where it says that. Verse 4. Then the glory of Adonai came into the house by way of the gate facing east. It doesn't say is that original eastern gate. It's saying that it's the gate facing east. Okay, so we have God coming from the east because last stop he did was at the Mount of Olives. He's coming from there. He's going into the sanctuary, but this is where he's going into the sanctuary, this thing, the Mikdash. Because why? Because in the Holy of Holies, that's where his throne is. That's where his visible glory was seen. Okay. Now, again, unless you study the temple, you don't, it's hard for us to understand. You have these walls. Here is simplified, but all these walls, there were like 5 walls. From the inside out, there were walls. Why? Because they had a whole bunch of little rooms, and they had passageways. And they used all these passageways. I mean, it's almost like a maze, like a labyrinth, okay? So it says in chapter 44, verse 1, then he brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary looking east. It was shut. And here in the Hebrew specifically says, he brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary looking east. And what's the other gate? Remember that this is the sanctuary. Okay, you have the stairs, you have a passageway, but this is the gate that he's talking about. This is the main gate going into the sanctuary. Okay. So he says, he brought me back to the outer gate of the sanctuary looking east. It was shut. This gate was shut. Why? Adonai said to me, this gate is to be shut. It must not be open. No one may enter through it, for the Adonai God of Israel has entered through it. So it must be kept shut. So it's not the gate from outside, because you can't close that gate, because that's the gate that people are going to come through. All the other gates. The only gate that's going to be shut is this one, because this is where God went through back into his Holy of Holies. The wicket. Not the main, and not the main gate. He comes through there. And this is in verse 4 says, then he brought me by the way of the north gate to the front of the house. This is the north gate. This is the eastern gate, the southern gate. This is the northern gate. Why? Because when the priest came in to open these gates, they would have to go through this wicket, because they're not coming up the stairs and opening directly here. They have to go up the stairs, go through this door, go through this passageway, come this way, and open from inside out. So the only gate that they could use to go in was this northern gate here. But this one always has to be kept shut, closed. Why? Because that's the way that God is coming back through. In other words, when Yeshua comes back, he's not coming through that gate that they already closed. It's through this gate.
Where's the gate that they already closed? Or was it up there?
No, it's all the way outside. Oh, it's way outside. It's the walls around the Temple Mount. No, they're, and go to Zechariah 14. Well, the temple's, the building's not there, so no. Once they build it, they have to build it with these 2 doors. Okay. Go to chapter 14 of Zechariah, verse 3. It says, then Adonai will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in a day of battle. In that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies to the east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in 2 from east to west, forming a huge valley. Half of the mountain will move toward the north and half of it towards the south. Okay? Because Yeshua is is the one who is going to enact all these things on behalf of Adonai. So the thing is that for the third temple to be built, they have to have a red heifer. Because without the red heifer, they cannot purify the priests, the Levites, so they can start functioning in the temple. So that's why they're looking forward to finding this red cow. And here's again another picture, and again it's showing you the wicked. This is looking from another view, seeing it from instead of sideways, seeing it straight up, looking directly according to the geography. Okay, so this is east, this is south. So this is the south wicket that has to be maintained closed because that's the entrance of the glory of God back into the holy. See all these little things? These are, they call them cells. They're rooms, small rooms. So there's a whole bunch of passageways. There were a whole bunch of passageways and rooms. So in between those things, the priest would walk and do things. But one of the Midrash says that in spite of God being who he is, he does not enter to the great gate, which is the principal gate of going into the holy place. He goes into a smaller gate. In other words, in his humility, and he's humble. Even in spite of who he is, he doesn't go to the great middle gate towards the sanctuary. He goes through a smaller gate. Okay. So going back to chapter 20. Any questions about, you might say, well, Pastor, all this is like, again, we don't understand it, but God says it's a permanent law that we have to do it. So when they're looking for this red cow, because they understand that once they find the 10th one, they know that it's the start of the Messianic age, because with that, they can start building, they can start purifying, so they can start doing the services in the new temple. Okay, and that is important because for Yeshua to be able to come back, these things have to be at least started, have to be in place. So in chapter 20, and besides everybody's in a state of impurity. Why? Because we all have been contaminated with a gazillion things. So we all have to go through those waters of purification. Ritual purification, because our moral purification, we have gotten that through Yeshua. Chapter 20, in the first month, the entire community of the children of Israel arrived at the wilderness of Zin. The people stayed at Kadesh, then there Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. One of the things they say is that there was a well that followed them through the wilderness. Okay, a well that followed them through the wilderness. But we know, but once Miriam dies, the tradition says that the water stopped. So now they're complaining because they can't find water. Okay, so they can't find water. So they start quarreling. And they say in verse 3, if only we had died when our brothers died before Adonai. He's talking about all the people that died with Korah and all the things that happened. Now, why have you brought the community of Adonai into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you brought us from Egypt to bring us to this evil place? A place without grain, fig, grapevine, or pomegranate, and there's no water to drink. Now, you have to understand that this is already around year 40. They've been walking around, and this is year 40. Remember that when they started out from Egypt, and they first started complaining of water, that there was a place that they stopped, and God told Moses to speak to the rock. He spoke to it, and water came out of it. They're back into that same spot. Okay? And it says, verse 6, so Moses and Aaron went from before the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. Again, they started praying because the people are complaining. Then the glory of Adonai appeared to them. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, take the staff and gather the assembly, you and your brother Aaron. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will give out its water. You will bring out water from the rock, and you will give the community something to drink along with their livestock. So Moses took the staff from before the presence of Adonai, just as he had commanded him. Remember the staff of Aaron? God said, put it in front of the ark. When it blossomed, he said, now go. He fetched it again, got it, and now he's doing this. Moses, verse 10, Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly in front of the rock. He said, listen now, you rebels. Must we bring you water from this rock? Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with the staff. Water gushed out, and the community and his livestock drank. So what is the difference? After 40 years, God is telling Moses, Moses, speak to the rock. And what does Moses do? He's mad. He's fed up with the people. 40 years, imagine, all this stuff, with all these troubles and all these problems, all these complaints. He's mad. He's angry. He hits the rock not once, twice. And so when it says here that water gushed out, in the Hebrew, it's almost like if you had opened a fire hydrant and water comes out to the point that is, people are just being flooded out of so much water. So the problem is that Moses, being the man who he was, with the qualities of leadership, his status in the eyes of God, instead of speaking to the rock, he hit the rock. And so it says in verse 12, but Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me so as to esteem me as holy in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you will not bring this assembly into the land that I have given to them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the children of Israel contended with Moses, and where Adonai showed himself holy among them. So in other words, because of this moment, he and Aaron are not going into the promised land. It sounds a little bit harsh, but God said, speak to the rock. He hits the rock. Now, even though the tradition says that it was Miriam, that a well was following her, please go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. First Corinthians 10, let's start with verse 1 to give it some context. For I do not want you to be ignorant, brothers and sisters, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. They all were immersed into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock that followed them. And the rock was Messiah. So it wasn't really Miriam's well. It was Messiah himself providing that water all this time. Okay. So the other verse from 14 to 20 is Edom denies them passage. And so they asked Edom if they could go through there, because remember now they're trying to get into the promised land and they have to cross Edom, and Edom says, no, you can't come through here. So now they have to take another route. And the other verses from 22 forward, we have that Aaron dies. And so they go up to Mount Hor, and there Aaron dies, and his position as high priest is given to his son Eleazar, and they mourn for Aaron for 30 days. Usually the tradition of mourning an individual is 7 days. But because of his greatness, they mourn for him for 30 days. Chapter 21. In chapter 21, we have the incident of the bronze serpent. So what's going on here? We already have Miriam's dead, Aaron's dead, so the only one left is Moses. And it says, when the Canaanite king of Arad, who lived in the Negev, heard that Israel was coming along the road to Atharim, he attacked Israel and captured some of them. Then Israel vowed to Adonai and stated, if you deliver this people into our hand, we will put their cities under the ban of destruction. Adonai listened to Israel's plea and delivered up the Canaanites. They put them and their cities under the ban of destruction, so the name of the place was called Hormah, which means destruction. They traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Sea of Reeds in order to go around the land of Edom. The spirit of the people became impatient along the way. Because remember, they wanted to go through Edom. Edom doesn't let them, so that means now they have to keep walking even further, going around Edom. Then the people spoke against God and Moses. Since Aaron isn't there, now they speak against God and Moses. Why have you brought us from Egypt to die in the wilderness? Because there is no bread, no water, and our very spirits detest the despicable food. Again, they're complaining about the manna. So Adonai sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died. The people came to Moses and said, we sinned when we spoke against Adonai and you. Pray to Adonai for us that he may take away the snakes. So Moses prayed for the people. So they get in trouble, and then Moses is the one to rescue them again. Adonai said to Moses, make yourself a fiery snake and put it on a pole. Whenever anyone who has been bitten will look at it, he will live. Now it's interesting that serpent in the Hebrew is the word nachash. Nachash. Because it's similar to the word for bronze, nachash. And so, where did I have that? I lost it. Nachash. And it's interesting that this word, its numerical value is 358. Okay, remember that all the words in Hebrew have a numerical value. Okay, so Nachash is serpent, but it also happens that Mashiach also has a value of 358. So they make the association between the serpent and Mashiach. And what's the association? That the serpents were biting the people and causing them to die, right? But God says, take it, make an image of the same serpent, put it on a pole, and when people look at it, they will live. So what he's trying to say is that it's not the serpent who gives life or death. It is I who give life or death. Okay. Now remember that in Matthew, it mentions, I think it's in Matthew that it mentions that the same way that Moses lifted up the serpent, that Yeshua would also be lifted up, and then anyone that would look at him would live. I think it's in, not Matthew, John. Go to John chapter 3. Go to John chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. The Gospel of John. John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. Where's John? I lost John. Hello, John. John chapter 3, 14 and 15. It says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert. Remember, the serpents were killing the people, but God said, lift up a bronze serpent. Remember, bronze has to do with judgment. And whoever looks at that serpent will live. Now we know that if the serpent is killing them, why look at a serpent? Because it's God who is in charge. It's God who gives life or who gives death. So when that serpent was lifted up, they lived. They looked at it. So it says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the desert, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, so that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. By looking at Yeshua, focusing on Yeshua is how we have eternal life. So that's why the term Nachash, serpent, in Hebrew has the same numerical value as the name Mashiach. Both have a numerical value of 358. Why? Because it's looking at Yeshua as he's being lifted up, like the same serpent being lifted up in the desert, is how we obtain eternal life. Because in Judaism, one way to study is by making comparisons of words that have the same numerical value, because if they have the same numerical value, they're associated. So therefore, Nachash, serpent, is associated with Mashiach. The same, it's related. Okay. And so after that, they try to journey through Moab, and they find the same situation, that the Moabites don't let them go through. And then we have that the king Sihon of the Amorites and the king Og also come against the people, but they're defeated. They're defeated. Go please to verse 34 of chapter 21. It says, Adonai said to Moses, do not fear him. I have given him with all his people and his land into your hand. You are to do to him just as you did to Sihon, the Amorite king who was living in Heshbon. So they struck him and his sons and his entire army until no survivor was left to him, and they possessed his land. Then in chapter 22, verse 1, it says, and the children of Israel set out and camped in the plains of Moab alongside the Jordan across from Jericho. So again, they're about to enter. But what happens? Then we go to the Torah portion of Balak. Any questions so far of what we read? So what's going on? Balak is who? He's called Destroyer, but he's the king of? He's the king of Moab. So what's the issue? Remember that they're camping around Moab. So he's already heard that these guys, this Israel has defeated the king of Arad, has defeated the king Sihon, has defeated the king Og. So what's going on? He thinks, okay, now they're going to come in here and going to kill us too. So the guy's afraid. So what does he do? He says, we got to get rid of these people. So it says in chapter 22, verse 4, Moab said to the elders of Midian, the multitude will lick up everything around us like the ox licks up the grass of the field. Now Balak, son of Zippor, was king of Moab at that time. He sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, at Pethor near the river in his native land, saying to him, look now, a people has come out of Egypt. See now, they cover the surface of the earth and are settling beside me. Come now, curse this people for me, because they are too strong for me. Perhaps I may be able to defeat them and drive them away from the country. I know that whoever you bless will be blessed, and whoever you curse will be accursed. So the thing is that Balaam has a reputation to being able to curse or bless. So the king of Moab is afraid of Israel. And so he says the only way I can defeat this people, because he understands that they carry a God, they are with a God that is very strong. So he understands this, so he wants to, in the spiritual world, be able to destroy these people, defeat them in a way, so that when he goes really against them with his army, he can take advantage. So he calls up this guy who has a reputation around all that area, around all the nations, of being someone that can curse or bless. Okay, especially his curses, more than anything else. He's looking for those curses. So Balaam is not a prophet, he is a sorcerer. Sorcerer. Or a warlock or something like that. Warlock. He's a pagan prophet. Okay. This guy is pagan, and so he makes use of magic. He makes use of sorcery to do these things. Okay, he's not a prophet of Hashem, like some people say. He's not a prophet that's under the will of God. He just does his own thing with any God, with whatever, whoever pays him better, the best, that's where he goes. So we know the story that he's the king of Moab sends messengers, and they tell him, we're going to pay you so much. All I need you is to come and curse this people. But in verse 10, it says, Balaam said to God, no, in verse 9, God came to Balaam and asked, who are these men with you? Balaam said to God, Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab, sent word to me. See the people coming out of Egypt, cover the surface of the land. Come now, curse them for me. Perhaps I will be able to fight against them and drive them away. God said to Balaam, do not go with them. Do not curse them, for they are blessed. So we know the story that they go back and forth asking him to go curse them. And Balaam says, the only way I can go is if I say exactly how the God of Israel tells me to say. Okay. So he gets there, and on his way, after God says, okay, you can go, but again, you cannot curse the people because they're blessed. And the thing is that he eagerly gets up, and in his heart, he says, okay, now I'm going to get the money that they promised me. So he goes out. His intention is evil. We know his intention is evil because when he's on his way to Moab, and he's on his donkey, an angel shows up trying to stop him. But the guy who supposedly is such a prophet, who supposedly is such a seer, who supposedly is so knowledgeable of these things, he can't see the angel, but the donkey sees it. So the angel shows up three times the donkey sways away from the angel to a point that Balaam is very upset, and he starts hitting the donkey and abusing her, and to the point that the donkey, God opens the mouth of the donkey, and the donkey talks to Balaam. He said, what the heck are you doing? I've been so faithful. You've known me since I was a little baby and all this stuff, blah, 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 blah. And Balaam is so mad that he speaks back to the donkey, not noticing that the donkey was speaking. Okay? And so when he realizes what's happening, he understands that in verse 28 says, then Adonai opened the donkey's mouth, and she said to Balaam, what have I done to you that you have beaten me these 3 times? And Balaam said to the donkey, because you've made a fool of me, if I had a sword in my hand, I would kill you now. And the donkey said, am I not your donkey, which you have ridden as always to this day? Have I ever been in the habit of doing this to you? No. Then Adonai opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel of Adonai standing in the road with his drawn sword in his hand, so he fell on his face. The angel of Adonai said to him, why have you beaten your donkey this 3 times? Behold, I came as an adversary, a Satan, because your way before me is a reckless one. The donkey saw me and turned away from me these 3 times. If she had not turned away from me, by now I would have killed you indeed, but let her live. Balaam said to the angel of Adonai, I have sinned, for I did not know that you were standing in the road to oppose me. Now, if this is displeasing in your eyes, I will go back home. The angel of Adonai said to Balaam, go with the men, but speak only the word that I tell you. So Balaam went with Balak's princes. So the issue is that here God basically makes a fool of him because he's this great prophet, and the guy can't even see the angel. And the donkey has to talk to him. So basically he's shaming him. So God lets him go. We know the story. He goes back and forth with Balaam. He goes to all these different places. He makes sacrifices. And every time he speaks, instead of speaking a curse, only blessing comes out of his mouth for the people of Israel. And so Balak is mad with him. He says, I brought you here and all you're doing is bless this people. I need you to curse them. And eventually at the last time that he goes up to the mountain and he starts where he can see the whole encampment of Israel, at that moment, even though he is a pagan prophet and even though he's a magician, a sorcerer, or whatever, God allows that the Holy Spirit really inspire him and receive a true prophecy, a true blessing towards the people of Israel. And in chapter 24, starting in verse 3, he says, he uttered his oracle and said, this is the oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, and the oracle of a strong man whose eye has been opened. In other words, now he's really receiving a message from God. The oracle of one hearing God's speech, one seeing Shaddai's vision, one fallen down yet with open eyes. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, and your dwellings, O Israel. That is part of the Shabbat Siddur. How lovely are your tents, O Israel, O Jacob, and your dwellings. Now, when it mentions tents, it's talking about the tabernacle, the Mishkan. When it says dwellings, it's talking about the temple, the future temple. Like valleys, they are spread out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by Adonai, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from his buckets, his seed by abundant water. His king will be greater than Agag, his kingdom will be exalted. God is bringing him out of Egypt like the strong horns of a wild ox. He devours nations hostile to him. He will crush their bones. His arrows will pierce them. He crouches like a lion or a lioness. Who would arouse him? He who blesses you will be blessed, and he who curses you will be cursed. So by this time, Balak is really, really mad. And so they go into a fight one with the other, and he says, I'm tired of you. Go your way. You're not going to get paid. You only bless these people. I can't stand it. And so Balaam tells him, but before I leave, let me tell you what's going to happen to your people. And so he starts speaking about what's going to happen to Amalek, what's going to happen to Edom, basically what's going to happen to all the enemies of Israel. And then he leaves. So in chapter 25, what we have is, in verse 25 of chapter 24 says, then Balaam got up and went and returned to his own place, and Balak went on his way. But we know that before he left, so he could get his money, he said, okay, I could not curse this people. But he tells Balak, and we know about that because I think it's in Revelation or in Jude where it says that it tells us exactly what, I think it's in Jude 20. Go to Jude chapter 20. The book of Jude or Judas or Judah. It's really Judah, not Jude. The book of Judah. Maybe it's not Judah or Jude 20. I can't find it. Sorry. I know I have it written somewhere in another Bible. I have so many Bibles, I write things in different ones. But there's a place where it talks about Balaam. And the thing with Balaam is that before he left, what he did was, okay, it's in Revelation 2:14. Go to book of Revelation 2:14. Okay, it says, but I have a few things against you. It's talking to the congregation in Pergamum. You have some there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who was teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat food sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. So before Balaam left, he told Balak, that's in Revelation chapter 2, verse 14. He told Balak, I could not curse them, but this is what you're going to do. You're going to send your most beautiful women into the camp. They're going to become very friendly with the men and convince them to go into sexual immorality, which is idolatry to their pagan gods, fertility rituals, and they're going to eat of their sacrifices. They're going to commit adultery, and that's how they themselves are going to curse themselves, because they're going to commit idolatry against God, and they're going to commit idolatry and sexual immorality and all these things. So in chapter 25, what it's saying, while Israel was staying in Shittim, the people began to have immoral sexual relations with women from Moab. Then they invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods. So the people were eating and bowing down before their gods. When Israel became bound to Baal of Peor, the anger of Adonai grew hot against Israel. In other words, they committed so much idolatry. They even ate the food sacrificed to their gods, has sexual relationships, immorality, sexual immorality. And so God becomes really mad with him and says, Adonai said to Moses, seize all the ringleaders and hang them before Adonai facing the sun, so that Adonai's fierce anger may be turned away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill your men who have been joining themselves to Baal of Peor. Baal is one of the gods of Moab. Then behold, a man from the children of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his brothers before the eyes of Moses and of the whole assembly of the children of Israel, while they were weeping at the entrance to the tent of meeting. When Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, saw the priest saw it, he arose from the midst of the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and went after the man of Israel into the tent and pierced him through, both the Israelite man and the woman's belly. Then the plague among the children of Israel was stopped. However, 24,000 were dead because of the plague. In other words, God sent a plague because they were doing all these things with the women from Midian. They were committing sexual immorality. They were doing idolatry. They were worshiping Baal. So God gets mad, sends a plague. And Pinchas is the guard, is the like the supervisor or the chief guardian of the tent, of the tabernacle. So he defends the honor of God by killing the guy that brought in this woman. And when it says that he brought him to the tent, that means they built a tent right next to the tabernacle of God to commit all these things. So Pinchas gets up and kills this guy with this woman. And so that stops the plague. So in the next Torah portion, we're going to be speaking about Pinchas. Because of what he did, God has a special covenant with him. I know this has been a lot. It's been 2 portions, a lot of stuff to try to digest. So if there's any questions, we're going to take those now.